We're ready for 2 Corinthians chapter 8. Paul spent several chapters discussing his ministry there in Corinth in connection with his defense of his apostleship because of some of his critics. And then in chapter 7, he kind of ended that discussion with these passages on repentance and reconciliation. And so he then pretty much abruptly then is ready to move on to something else, something that's important to him and to the work of the church at that time. And so because of that, in other words, the Corinthian church, even though they had some problems and they had some issues with Paul, they weren't the only thing on his mind, obviously. He had a lot of other things on his mind. One of those was this gathering, this collection that he was getting together from the Gentile churches in Europe and Asia, Roman province of Asia, to take to the poor saints in Judea. And so he changes gears here, and because of that, Paul, through the Holy Spirit, gives us probably, I guess, the most extensive discussion of giving found not only in the New Testament, but all the Bible, because it covers both chapters 8 and 9. And so he is using this opportunity to encourage the Corinthians to give generously to this project. He had just talked about, of course, his joy that Titus had brought, number one, just by showing up, and number two, about bringing a good report about the church there and the way they handled the last letter that he sent them. But notice, let's read verses 1 through 5. Moreover, brethren, we make known to you, I think the King James says, we do you to wit. That's obviously pretty outdated. But a good translation is, we make known to you the grace of God bestowed on the churches of Macedonia, that in a great trial of affliction, in the abundance of their joy and their deep poverty abounded in the riches of their liberality, or you could translate that generosity. For I bear witness that according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability, they were freely willing, imploring us with much urgency that we would receive the gift and the fellowship of the ministering to the saints. And not only as we had hoped, but they first gave themselves to the Lord and then to us by the will of God. Well, I guess the question first arises is, why is it always that we're talking about the saints being poor in Judea as opposed to perhaps some other segments of the Roman Empire? And there could be several reasons for that. According to historians and commentators, one reason is many times Jews who had left their homeland during that time, and either whether on their own or by force, and living in other parts of the world of the Roman Empire, many times as they aged and got older, they would have this desire to move back to Israel or to the Palestine and die there. And because of that, sometimes they would arrive with not much in the way of resources. Of course, we know from Acts 11:28 that Judea had suffered from a pretty severe famine several years before this letter was written. I'm sure that added to it. And apparently, ever since the time of Herod the Great, Judea had been taxed terribly. We won't say what party Herod was from, but he was the party of tax and spend, if you will, and most likely spending it on himself, because that's the way it was. I mean, we take it for granted here in this country because of capitalism and free enterprise and the Judeo-Christian work ethic that there's just a middle class everywhere, and that's not true, and that's not been the case for most of the history of the world. Generally, in most places throughout history, you've had the haves and the have-nots. You haven't really had a whole lot of in between, and certainly that was the case in Judea. And so I think probably another reason that commentators talk about, and I don't know how long this lasted, but You recall in Acts 2, you had that huge gathering of Jews from the Roman Empire for what purpose? Why were they in Jerusalem in Acts 2? Feast of Pentecost, and so it would appear that when the church was established and all these people were being converted, that many of them stayed for quite some time in order to, of course, fellowship with one another, learn at the apostles' feet, so forth, until at least you recall when they were scattered and went abroad everywhere preaching the gospel because of the persecution that arose after the stoning of Stephen. And so that may have contributed to some of this poverty as well. But at any rate, they needed it, and Paul had several motives, it would appear, from various places in the New Testament. Number one, from Galatians 2, and you recall Paul was always writing and telling, and he told the other apostles, they would ask him, remember the poor, and he would say, what? Yeah, sure, I will remember the poor. That's part of our obligation. And so that was just a general obligation that he took seriously. But also, we can go back to Romans. When we studied Romans, we know part of Paul's motivation here was to help with the tension between Gentile and Jewish churches. And one way to do that, of course, would be to take this large collection from a group of Gentile churches to help poor churches, Jewish churches, in Judea. And that would be one way to bring these people together, to make them see, hey, we're all part of one body, one family. And so that obviously was one of his motivations that we see in various passages, Romans 15:27 and others. And I think too, if you go to Romans 15, he talks about how that, hey, the Gentile churches had benefited from Jewish wealth. To what extent? What kind of wealth had Gentile converts enjoyed from their Jewish counterparts? Spiritual wealth, spiritual blessings. After all, Christ came through the Jews. The Messiah came through the Jews. There's 1,500 years of God speaking to the Jews through the old law and then bringing His Son into the world through them. And so Paul says, look, it's only right. You enjoy these spiritual blessings because of them. It's only right that you help them physically. And so those were some of his motivations. He uses this word throughout this text, grace, charis, and other variations. And he calls giving a grace because we know that grace is simply, generally when you boil it down to its simple definition, it's favor. God's grace is His favor upon us. And so grace should come to express itself, Paul tells these people, in action, generous action. How does God express His grace to us? It's always in action, right? In the blessings of various kinds that He gives us, whether spiritual or material. And so grace is kind of a three-dimensional concept, if you will. You can receive it, you can practice it, and you can give God thanks for it. And so he holds up this generosity, this grace of the Macedonian Christians. So he starts out in the very beginning with an example to these people. Okay, Corinthians, how are you supposed to give? How should you give? Well, I'll tell you what. Give like the Macedonian churches. Let me give you an example. Corinth was in Achaia. The Macedonian churches were churches like Philippi and Thessalonica on the northern part of the Greek peninsula. And he says, follow their example. And if you do, number one, we see the background of the Macedonian giving. Look at verse 2. What's the background of their giving? In great what? Trial of affliction. Right? Trial of affliction. Also, later in the verse he says, I think somebody might have said it, deep poverty. So there's the background of their giving. They were in trial of affliction and deep poverty. We don't know exactly what the trial of affliction might be, but certainly could very well be, more than likely, persecution that caused them to be poor. Or at least had some effect or some it was one factor in their poverty was the persecution they were undergoing. And yet they had been generous in spite of it. And when you're experiencing God's grace and when you appreciate it, it will lead you to be a good giver regardless of what you have. And I think we all know intuitively, and we've seen it. In this country, we like to play class warfare between those who have something and maybe those who have less. But the bottom line is, and I've seen this, and you've seen it too, generosity or stinginess has nothing to do with how much money you have. I've seen people that were very generous that had a lot of money, and people that were very generous that didn't have much, like these Macedonians. But I've seen people that were extremely covetous and stingy that had a lot of money, and I've seen people that were extremely covetous and stingy that had not much at all. It doesn't really matter. It's all about what? It's all about our disposition. Not so much what we have, whether we're stingy or whether we're generous. And so these people were suffering, and yet look at their attitude, look at their disposition, look at the Macedonians. In great trial of affliction, the abundance of their what? Joy. And deep poverty there in the Greek literally means rock bottom poverty, basically. And so they still did it with joy. And look down, say about verse 4. What are they doing? They're imploring. Well, what's another word for imploring? Begging with much urgency that we take it. And so we see, their disposition. And notice somebody says, well, how much? Everybody's wanting, that's the big question, right? That's the question. Because, in the Old Testament, God gave them, He gave them the percentages. It was more than 10. I mean, that's just kind of a start. But they had other things they had to give too. Of course, I realize that they were a theocracy. That is, their government was religious in nature. That was their government. But nevertheless, God gave them all these numbers. Well, that's easy to do, right? But we're kind of like that way. We want numbers. And somebody says, well, how much? Well, He tells us how much. How much does He tell you to give in this verse? What's the last word in the verse? Verse 2. Liberality, generosity. You say, well, how much is that? How much do I have to give to be liberal or generous? Well, that's for you to figure out, God says. But we're going to see later in this chapter, if we're going to be like God or like Christ, well, let's think about how much they gave, and we'll get to that. So he overflows with praise for these Macedonians, verse 3, for I bear witness that God, according to their ability. Paul was pretty much amazed at not only their willingness, but what? They went beyond. First he says, according to their ability, yes, and beyond their ability. Basically, Paul says these were second-mile Christians, right? Jesus said, in that day, if one of those Roman soldiers came up to you and compelled you to walk a mile, carry his stuff, which, the Jews would have hated, be told what to do by their captors. Carry my stuff for me for the next mile. And that's all they could demand was a mile. And Jesus said, well, you don't go a mile, go 2. Well, these people were second-mile Christians, beyond their ability, more than Paul had expected. But he said, you know what? It's more than that. It's their attitude. They did it, what? I think the King James says of their own accord, but the New King James says freely willing. Nobody forced them to. Paul didn't make them. Paul would have, from all I can see, Paul would honored and we'll see later in this chapter, if the Corinthians said, well, we're just not going to give anything toward this ministry or toward this work today, Paul would have honored that. He wouldn't have made them, because he says later, I don't want this to be of coercion. That's not what God wants from us. But they were freely willing, and then notice the purpose that they gave, imploring us with much urgency, basically begging him that we would receive the gift. That word gift, by the way, is translated in the Greek is the same word as grace, favor, charis. So it's translated in some modern translations throughout this chapter as gracious gift or gracious work. That we would receive the gift, and notice, what's it for? The fellowship of the ministering to the saints, right? Support of these saints that needed it. And Paul might have been inclined to say, hey, you really can't afford that, but yet they're begging him to take it. And I think we learn a lot from this, but he said, I'm not going to deprive them of this joy. Sometimes we don't. We need to remember that as elders and other members of the church. Sometimes people want to do something for us. And we tend, especially in this country, we're kind of independent, self-sufficient, so forth. We don't like necessarily people having to do for us. So we think we're being nice, right? When we say, no, that's fine, I'll take care of it, I'll deal with it, I don't need your help, blah, blah, blah. When in fact, sometimes what we're doing is we're robbing these people of an opportunity to give and find joy in that. And of course, there's a fine line between being manipulative and lazy and taking advantage of people and accepting someone's genuine help. Paul said, I wasn't going to crash their party here and wreck their joy and take it away from them. They begged me. But it was for this work, this desire. See, that word fellowship, that's that word we talk about, koinonia, joint participation. And I think too here that also reminds us, by the way, that word koinonia is also in chapter 9 going to be translated contribution. But they wanted to contribute. They wanted to be part of this ministry. And I think that what that tells us too today is we have to remember, as busy as we might be and as much as we might have going on in our own individual congregations, we're still part of something bigger than that. We're part of a church that spans this globe. And so it's certainly nothing wrong with, and in fact, we should be looking for opportunities to be part of the worldwide church community, to share in this participation and this fellowship. And so they're enjoying God's grace. They're partners with God. They're sharing with these other Gentile churches and other parts of the Gentile world and helping these fellow Christians in another part of the world. And so in verse 5, we mentioned last week, as a prelude to this, Paul gets to the secret of giving. We've talked about, well, how much? Well, it's liberal or generous. Well, what's the secret to being a good giver? Well, he tells us in verse 5. And not only as we had hoped, but what? First gave themselves to the Lord, and then to us by the will of God. Well, you want somebody's money or resources. If God's going to get your money and resources, He's got to get what first? Well, He's got to get you first, right? And if you or I really give of ourselves fully to Him, then these other things, they're not big decisions. They're not difficult decisions to give generously or sacrificially, because you want to. This is, like I think Evan mentioned in his sermon this morning at Kirby Pines, Colossians chapter 3. If you're risen with Christ, then set your mind and affections where He is, right? Seated at the right hand of God on things above. And if that's our attitude, then this other part will just come with it. And of course, notice here he says, it's a two-parter really. Paul says they not only gave themselves to God, but who else did they give themselves to us? Or to who else did they give themselves to? I just gave the answer. To Him, to us, to His group. And remember, that's important to him. This has been personal, this whole letter. He's had his critics in Corinth. He's defending himself. We know that most of the people didn't feel that way about him there, but some did. And so this was important to him. And he said, look, this is not only showing their loyalty to God, but to me. And frankly, it wasn't just personal for him, but also, Paul had apostolic authority. And he had a responsibility to teach people and make sure they were doing what they were supposed to be doing. And so it was important to him. And so he holds them up as an example to the Corinthians. So rather than just telling them, he could have started this chapter saying, here's what you need to do. Right? Here's the way you need to do this. You need to give to this collection, and here's why. He actually starts out with this example. And of course, the interesting thing is, we'll see later on, he uses the Corinthians as an example to the Macedonians. Now, he's not being disingenuous, but he understands that, you hold up one group to the other, and then you hold this group up to the other. Neither one of them wants to do what? They don't want to be disappointing. They don't want to be somebody say, oh yeah, they're the stingy ones or something. Nobody wants to be on that end. So, pretty smart of Paul, obviously of the Holy Spirit. It was true, but he uses other Christians at a distance to inspire them. So, this next section basically for about verses 6 through 15, he's encouraging them to finish what they started. So we urge Titus that as he had begun, so would he also complete this grace, some translations say gracious work, in you as well. But as you abound in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge and all diligence and in your love for us, see that you abound in this grace also. Well, so Titus, apparently, if you look down in verse 10, you go over to chapter 9, verse 2, it would seem that Paul started this whole thing, this ball rolling, a year ago. I don't know a year from when, but he says a year. And at some point when Titus probably was there the last time, he had maybe they hadn't done a whole lot. So Titus kind of said, hey, you need to get to working on this and be getting it together. Because when he sends, he's going to send Titus and a couple of other fellows at least with this letter back to them. And so he says, I urge Titus that as he had begun, he'd already been working on it with the Corinthian church, he would also complete this grace, this gracious work. Well, we've talked before about how important Titus was to Paul's work. And obviously this was important to him. If he's going to send Titus and this letter and these other fellows, this is important. He's passionate about it. He wants a substantial amount. And these people in Judea, they're not just any poor people, but they were the first to receive the gospel, and he wants them to have a part in that. So, it's interesting to me in verse 7, no matter what shortcomings these people had, if you go back over to, 1 Corinthians 12 and 13, and I think at the beginning of the book when we studied it, go back to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 6, when he, in his introduction, verse 5, You are enriched in everything by Him, in all utterance and all knowledge. These are spiritual gifts. Even as the testimony of Christ was confirmed in you, so that you come short in no gift. So with all the problems this church has, he said, look, you still were blessed with these gifts. And he talks about regulating them in chapters 12 and 13 and 14. But notice here he mentions it again. I think some of these things he mentions are spiritual gifts. Maybe not all of them, obviously. Love and so forth. But as you abound in everything, in faith and speech and knowledge, in this context, he says, look, you abound in these things. You abound in this grace, this gracious work also. He's given you gifts. So be generous back. Be givers like God. And as we said before, giving works best when it's willing and not coerced, not grudging. Verse 8, I speak not by... Notice, he says, I speak not by commandment. Well, Paul was an apostle. He was an ambassador for Christ. He had authority. Could he have spoken by commandment? And said, hey, you got to do it. Could have. He said, but I'm not going to do that. But I am testing the sincerity of your love by the diligence of others. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ, that though He was rich, yet for your sakes He became poor, that you through His poverty might become rich. I don't want you to do it grudging or out of, you've been told to. I'm testing you, comparing you to the generosity of brothers and sisters in other places. And besides that, I want you to do something else. I want you to imitate who? We talk about God as our Father, and children want to be like their fathers, right? So, we're supposed to be wanting to become more like God each day. Well, you can't become more like God than being a generous giver, Paul says. For you know the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ. You want to bask in God's grace? Look at the way He gave. He was rich. Well, how many people... I know there's some rich people in this world. We get told it all the time when we see these guys, campaigning for politicians or and all that kind of thing. He's worth so many billions. I even heard somebody say the other day somebody was going to be the first trillionaire at some point. I don't remember who that was, but was that Elon? I don't know. But you got all these rich people on different sides of the political spectrum. But you don't get any richer than the second member of the Godhead from eternity. And the reason I know that is because the second member of the Godhead, known as the Word before His incarnation, John chapter 1 says, is the creator of this universe. So does Hebrews chapter 1. Everything belongs to Him, to Christ. Hebrews says the world goes on because He upholds it by the word of His power. Every breath we take, as Sting used to say, is in the hands of Christ. It'll go as long as He wants it to. He owns it all. And yet for our sakes, for these Corinthian sakes, He became poor. And He was poor. So, you want to give, try giving like that, Paul says. You can become more like Christ. He is the supreme pattern of Christian living. Self-sacrifice is the source of generosity. Of course, God's grace was in initiating salvation through Christ. Reaching out to people that were in sin, that is, reaching out to His enemies, people who didn't deserve it, us. We'd done nothing to deserve His grace. It's interesting, sometimes poverty is equated with piety. Even in scriptures. I mean, Jesus was poor, and he identified with poor people, and he went to poor people. And if you talk to some of these teenagers, because I know it was my experience when I was going on these campaigns, if you talk to them, generally speaking, when you're on a campaign and you're knocking doors, what neighborhoods generally respond the best? Obviously, it's the poorer neighborhoods. Why is that? Yeah, I mean, you don't, unless you feel a need or know you need something, you're not going to be too inclined to be concerned about it. So if you don't have a lot, yeah. But the key, you don't, we don't please God by making ourselves poor physically. I mean, that's not what he's after. In fact, if you go to the Sermon on the Mount, the kind of poverty that Jesus is looking for is what? Blessed are who? The poor in spirit. Those who are bankrupt in spirit, literally. That's the kind of poverty he's looking for. Because he knows if that's your spirit, if that's your disposition, the rest won't be a problem. You won't be caught up. Even if you have a lot, which is fine, nothing wrong with that. But you won't be caught up in it. It won't be your end-all and be-all and your central focus. Nothing wrong with having it, but it won't. You know that there's something beyond that and better and more important. So you need to follow through with your resolve. And in this I give advice, verse 10, it is to your advantage not only to be doing what you began and were desiring to do a year ago. I want you to desire it, not be told, not be forced to do it. But now you must also complete the doing of it. That as there was a readiness to desire it, so there also may be a completion out of what you have. For if there's first a willing mind, it is accepted according to what one has and not according to what he does not have. You could say this in a lot of areas of life when Paul tells these people to finish what they started. But we need to be people of our word, right? Not just in this and every facet of our life. Somebody asks me to do something and I say, yes, I will do it, then I need to do it. That's what Christians do. I mean, they do what they say they're going to do. If you're not going to do it, what? Don't say you're going to do it, right? Sometimes I'll hear people complain. Oh, I got to fix a meal for so-and-so, or, I got to do this or I got to do that. No, you don't have to do it. Don't say you're going to do it if you don't want to do it. And I certainly don't want people to sign up a list out there and say they're going to do something and then complain about it. I don't want to hear it. I know God doesn't want to hear it. If you don't want to do it, don't do it. Don't pretend to be something you're not, in other words. If you're going to say, well, yeah, I'll chip in and do this work and then complain about it the whole time, I doubt it's really going much as far as God's concerned. None of us like to hear that. So if you want to do something, then do it and be happy about it and take some joy in it. And we all do that. I realize it. We all do it. We get busy and maybe we bite off more than we can chew and we sign up for too much. And then either we don't do it, which is bad, or we do it, but we do it complaining all the way, and that's just as bad. So, he says, do it and be like those Macedonians and take joy in it. For if there is a willing mind, that's what he wants, a willing mind, not a begrudging one. And they had it. I mean, if you go to 1 Corinthians 1:26, you remember he talks about not many mighty are called, not many noble, not many rich are called according to the flesh. Well, when he says not many, then that implies what? Some are. There are some of you that got the money. Okay? I realize not everybody does, but some of you do. And God doesn't demand of things he doesn't demand anything of us that we can't do. If there's a willing mind, is it accepted according to what one has and not according to what he does not have? See, God, this is a biblical principle. Taxation from the government ought to be, I'll just say it right here for people on the internet too. It ought to be a flat rate, not progressive. Because progressive taxation means what? What is the root? Why do we have a progressive tax rate system? What does that come from, the idea? You've got too much, you don't deserve it. And the rest of us don't, and it's not fair. Life's not fair. So I will steal your money through the government. It's immoral. A progressive tax rate system is immoral. It's saying, you've got too much and I want it, and because I can't have it, I'll just take it from you. If somebody walked into my house and said, give me everything you've got, he would be arrested. The government walks into my house and says, give me everything you've got, and it's taxation. Progressive. That's why you have 10% tax rates and 20% tax rates and 35% tax rates, because people are envious and they say it's not fair, so therefore we're going to redistribute the wealth. A flat rate tax is fair for everybody. You give just like this verse says. God says you give according to what you have, what you don't have. Well, somebody says the tax rate's 10%. How much do you have? What's in your pocket today? Well, I got $10. So how much are you going to give? You're going to give $1. If the government had a 10% tax rate. And then if I said, well, how much do you have, Kenneth? Kenneth says, I got a $100 bill in my pocket. And I said, well, you better go break it because you owe $10. That's 10%. Well, did Kenneth give more than Don, who only had $10 in his pocket? Yeah, he gave more than Don. He gave according to what he had. He had $100 and he gave $10. He only had $10 and he gave $1. But you know what? They gave the same percentage. Well, Tony's got $1,000. I know Tony keeps at least $1,000 in his pocket. He's like Jed Clampett. He just pulls it out of his pocket in a roll. Well, Tony's going to give $100. Did Tony give more than the other two? Yeah. He gave what? According to what he had, not what he didn't have. So that's my political speech for the day. But it's biblical. For I do not mean that others should be eased and you burdened. Now, somebody's thinking, well, if I got to give to this work and to these poor people in Judea, sometimes like we think today, I've got to deny myself and my family some things. You're going to make me sacrifice, right? And these people, while they benefit, well, first of all, I doubt that their contribution, the contribution is still going to be just enough to help these people probably survive. You're not going to make them rich. But somebody says, you know, why should they benefit at my expense? Well, you know, sometimes we give to people. You ever give to one of those people that's standing at all the exit ramps or in the middle of the intersections? I do sometimes. Depending on what they look like. I know new tennis shoes when I see them. And I know people that look like they're bad off when I see them. But be that as it may, once I give it to them, then the responsibility, the burden of giving shifts from where? Shifts from me to them. I can't guarantee. Paul couldn't guarantee that every one of these Judeans was going to use the money properly or even should get it. And I can't guarantee you to that today, that everybody you give something to is going to use it properly. But the responsibility of how they use it shifts to them, not me. Now, I don't think I should be throwing my money around to people that I know. I mean, we've had people come through this parking lot. I love this stuff. You can't make it up. Well, I was driving from Kansas City to Macon, Georgia, and I'm out of gas. Give me a few dollars for gas. First question I ask them is, why did you leave? Why did you get in your car to make a trip when you knew you couldn't make it? You didn't have enough money for gas. You're telling me you got in your car and you're going to drive all the way across country. So what you're telling me is you knew that you couldn't make it and you were just going to stop and beg people for money. That's what you're telling me. Yeah. So, well, I'm not giving it to you. Well, that's not right. Tell me that. You tell me you need something to eat, that's one thing. But don't tell me you left to make a trip and didn't have enough money for gas. Well, Aunt so-and-so's funeral. Not everybody gets to make the funeral. Sorry, it's tough, but you know. I know people here that don't always get to make funerals they want to make. I don't even know why we're talking about that. But I do know this. We'll pick up about verse 14 next week.